Greetings, APUSH scholars, coming to you from the high school library, Unit 10, on reform movements, populism, and progressivism. Who are the populists? Populists are a party primarily of farmers. It's more of a rural party, although they do try to make common cause with Eastern workers, which basically doesn't work in the 1896 election when all is said and done. Some things that the populists wanted in their 1896 platform: they wanted a graduated income tax. They wanted nationalization of the railroads and telegraphs. They wanted to reclaim and redistribute railway land grants. They wanted a government sub-treasury plan, which involved the government taking farmers' grain, storing it, and allowing them to use it for collateral to get government banknotes, which they could use as currency. They wanted an 8-hour day. They wanted to end railroad rebates. They wanted to end more expensive long-haul rates. They wanted direct election of U.S. senators. They wanted the initiative, the referendum, the recall, the secret ballot, and they wanted a bigger money supply. And the famous quote here is free silver, which is basically a call for the use of silver coins to increase the money supply, essentially to cause inflation, which debtors want, and the farmers were perennially in debt. And they ran for president. William Jennings Bryan on a fusion ticket. He is both the candidate for the Democrats and for the Populist Party. The big populist issue is primarily this free silver idea of 16:1 ratio, silver being minted and issued along with gold. So not a single gold standard, but a gold and silver standard. And they call this bimonetization or bimetallism. The idea is to put more money in circulation. Farmers need to, they're cash poor for much of the year, and they need to borrow money, and the problem is they're paying these really staggering interest rates. So the idea here is more money available will mean cheaper cost of borrowing, cheaper debt for the farmers. Cross of Gold speech is this famous speech by William Jennings Bryan. One of the quotes is, "Thou shalt not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And again, it's referring to this perceived control of banks over the farmers and the exploitation of farmers. And this does turn off some of the Catholic immigrants. It sounds very much like a Protestant sermon, and it's in the context here of declining power politically and economically of farmers as the country industrializes, and the farmers are, because the irony here is the farmers are so successful in growing crops, and an overproduction of crops drives prices relentlessly down, and the farmers increasingly are in debt and being driven off their land because of this debt. The sub-treasury plan is this plan the populists have that the farmers will be able to store their crops in government warehouses, and the idea is to sell it when prices are high, not when prices are low at the time of a harvest, and that this grain will be collateral for banknotes that the government will give them to use as currency. The three progressive presidents are Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. And Taft's relationship to Teddy is Teddy essentially, a very good friend of Taft, and he appoints or anoints him as his successor. Teddy Roosevelt and the Square Deal. The Square Deal is this idea of a level playing field, and Teddy's quote here is that there should be fair play. And Teddy should know his attitude towards monopolies. He wasn't against all monopolies. He was against bad monopolies. How do you know? Well, it's subjective. He knew ones that were, who were violating fair play, who were not allowing a level playing field. So, he busted up some monopolies, but not all. And the two of the monopolies that he famously busts up are Standard Oil, which is Rockefeller's monopoly, and Northern Securities, which is this big Northeast railway conglomeration, basically under the control of J.P. Morgan. So Teddy Roosevelt sort of dusts off the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and he busts up these monopolies. The new nationalism is Teddy Roosevelt's plan when he runs. This is after he's left the White House. He comes back and he sort of throws a monkey wrench into the Republican Party by breaking off the progressives, and he runs as a progressive Republican or a bull moose. And the 1912 New Nationalism is a platform of government protection of basically American, human welfare here. 8-hour day, minimum wage for women, a limit on injunctions, stopping strikes, farm relief, workers' compensation, an inheritance tax, an income tax, women's suffrage, direct election of U.S. senators, social insurance for the elderly, and unemployment, consumer protection along the lines of the later Food and Drug Administration, and conservation, of course. Teddy Roosevelt is the guy who starts out our national forests and national parks. The Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890, the intention was to bust up monopolies, but it was used to break up, to stop labor unions. And labor unions were seen as conspiracies against free trade, a restraint on free trade. So very ironic and not what the intention was. And remember the E.C. Knight case. The E.C. Knight case at the end of the 1800s will sort of gut the Sherman Antitrust Act for all practical purposes. Remember, the American sugar refining company had 98% monopoly of sugar production, but they were not considered a monopoly because they were ruled to merely be a manufacturer and not a distributor. Remember, the constitutional rationale behind the Sherman Antitrust Act is Congress can restrict and control interstate trade. Remember the whole Gibbons versus Ogden thing here. And but if you're not a trader, if you're merely a manufacturer, then, hey, this doesn't apply to you. So if it doesn't apply to the 98% of production of refined sugar, it doesn't apply to any company. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is basically pulled out, dusted off, and used by Teddy against Standard Oil and Northern Securities, among other companies. The anthracite coal miners, 1902, it's the first strike in U.S. history where the U.S. federal government intervenes as a neutral arbitrator. And Teddy Roosevelt forces a meeting of the mine owners and the miners succeed in getting a 10% raise, and the 10-hour day goes down to 9 hours. And this the strike was a big deal because basically as winter is approaching and there's no coal, people are looking at being pretty cold in the winter. So Teddy Roosevelt steps in what is essentially looking at being a national emergency. Muckrakers are expose journalists who held up corruption, held up poverty, held up oppressive monopolistic behavior for public inspection for the purpose of promoting reform. And Teddy's view was that the expose journalists were a bunch of troublemakers, that they were agitators, that they stirred up a lot of mud, and they weren't always productive in what they were doing. Remember, Teddy is a realist. He doesn't want to tear apart all the monopolies. He feels corporate America, industrial America is here to stay, and overall it's good. It's the bad guys that should be taken down a peg. Upton Sinclair is the author of The Jungle, this expose of the Chicago stockyards and the meatpacking industry, and this leads to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Jacob Riis, and How the Other Half Lives, is writing about poor working and poor housing conditions in the tenements, primarily along the East Coast with the immigrants. 4 progressive amendments that you should be familiar with. There is the 16th Amendment, which is an income tax amendment, and this is being balanced with the reduction of the tariff for the everyday middle-class American. The idea is you'll take it at the other end, out from the top, from the rich guys. 17th Amendment, direct election of U.S. senators. Remember, before this, the state legislatures picked the U.S. senators, so this holds the senators more directly accountable to the electorate. 18th Amendment is prohibition, which bans the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating beverages. And the arguments for this moral, the Christian Protestant America says, drunkenness is wrong and you should not be drinking. And there's the argument that this protects families, women and children, from men who might beat them, men who would drink the money away at the bar, or maybe foolishly gamble it away, whatever you do when you're drunk. It's also a slap at these immigrants, these Catholics and Jews, these Eastern, Southern, Central Europeans who don't have a problem with drinking. Well, it's basically kind of a slap at their existence and their behavior. And because this is passed after World War I, but it's being pushed at a time when grain production, this is all going for the war effort, and there's the argument that prohibition is good for wartime productivity. Mueller versus Oregon, the justification for this Supreme Court case in upholding a state restriction on working hours for women is that women are fragile, that women's health needs to be taken into account, that women are weak and needed at home. So it's an interesting Supreme Court reform support because it's not based upon the need of all Americans, but that women are fragile and not truly equal to men. What helped women's suffrage pass? Well, we just fought World War I, and we want democracy in Europe. We need democracy here as well. But there's also another piece to this, and that is these hordes, these huge waves of new immigrants, many of them Catholic, Jewish, Polish, Italian, Southern Europe, Eastern, Central Europe, these odd, these strange, threatening immigrant men who are quickly becoming citizens. The thinking here is if we get good Protestant women to vote, that their morality, their good godliness will balance out these suspect new immigrants who are voting in greater numbers. Teddy Roosevelt and conservation. Remember, Teddy's the guy who starts our national park, our national forest system. And when Teddy essentially puts Taft into place, following him, Teddy steps down following the George Washington precedent of 2 terms, and every president's been 2 terms up to this point. Well, Taft puts a guy named Richard Ballinger into office as head of the Department of Interior, and there's a dispute with U.S. Forest Chief Gifford Pinchot, who is a Roosevelt holdover, and the dispute is over Ballinger putting 3 million acres of public forest back into private use. And Teddy feels that this is a betrayal. Another thing that Taft does, he goes after U.S. Steel, that it's a monopoly, and Teddy guaranteed U.S. Steel that they would be left alone. They were considered by him to be a good monopoly. So Taft is not doing what Teddy wanted him to do, which leads to the 1912 election. The Republicans will split. Taft will be running for re-election, and Teddy will challenge him, which is kind of sad. These guys were friends, and this drove a division between them. And Teddy will run as a progressive Republican. When he's asked by the press how he feels, he says he beat his chest, and he said he felt like a bull moose. So the nickname here is the bull moose ticket. So the 4 candidates are Taft and Teddy, 2 Republicans, divided over sort of the extent of what progressive reforms there should be. And Woodrow Wilson, who will win the election, he is a progressive governor of New Jersey. And the 4th candidate, interesting, is our man who we've discussed earlier in other units, Eugene Debs, who is running on a socialist ticket, and he gets about 800,000 votes. And all of these candidates are running on some various version of reform, of progressivism. Wilson's 3-part program is to attack the triple wall of privilege: the tariff, the bank, and the trust. And the Underwood tariff cuts the tariff for the middle-class consumer. The Federal Reserve Act puts a leash on the banking system. And the Clayton Antitrust Act puts new teeth into antitrust law and specifically singles out labor unions as being exempt from injunctions under this act. Progressives ignored what badly needed reform. The badly needed reform is an end to Jim Crow, an end to racial segregation, an end to discrimination, an end to lynching, and this isn't on the this isn't on the menu. This isn't on the table here. And Wilson is an openly racist president, and he segregates federal office buildings, which before had been integrated. He segregates the Navy, the Treasury, and the Postmaster General buildings. He has applicants supply photographs so he can make sure that for government jobs, to make sure that they're not black. He defends segregation as a way of reducing friction between blacks and whites. When asked about his feelings on the Civil War, he said that slavery was wrong on economic, not moral grounds. And he defended the Ku Klux Klan as being sort of the logical, what do you expect when you have all this abuse by carpetbaggers and the Northern Army in the South. And he famously had he watched The Birth of a Nation at the White House, and this is this famous racist movie where the Ku Klux Klan are heroes, and the Reconstruction effort is unjust, and the Redeemers are the champions of Southern freedom, putting blacks back in their place. So unfortunately here, Wilson, the last thing he was concerned about was the position of the black man in American society. Municipal socialism, this is local government takeover of water and electric utilities for the purpose of cheap, fair, regulated rates for the local consumer. And finally, women progressives. The AP loves feminist history, loves women's history. The AP is definitely very politically correct, so know your women. Whenever you see a woman who's being mentioned in your book, file her away. Ida Tarbell, who wrote that series in McClurg magazine, The History of Standard Oil, in which she discusses the machinations of John D. Rockefeller and getting rebates and demanding rebates to undersell his competitors and driving his competition out of business. Ida Wells, her writings on lynching and Jim Crow in the South. Helen Jackson Hunt, Century of Dishonor, the mistreatment of Indians and the betrayal of these treaties that are signed over time with the Indians. Jane Addams, her Settlement House in Chicago and the Settlement House movement. Whole House is the name of her sort of a social welfare house that helped immigrant women adapt. Margaret Sanger and her push for birth control, legalizing it, legalizing access to information. Of course, the whole cast of suffragettes and women's writers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, and Lucy Burns, all their work leading up to the 19th Amendment, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is a women's organization which very effectively organizes support for the 18th Amendment. So that's kind of our drive-by review here for reform under the Populists and the Progressives. Do look over your notes. I've got all the PowerPoints on RenWeb documents. And study well, study hard, and make sure you know it. Good luck.